Sirens swallowed the night as armored transports cut through downtown, and a containment dome began to bloom over a shattered plaza, because something the size of a rumor had refused to behave like one. Vought's tactical teams were already in the smoke, shouting orders, firing scanners, a live feed hovering above them, where a single bald man stood in the center of falling concrete, unhurt, unblinking, and far too calm for the kind of panic descending around him. A flash of blue and crimson pushed through the cordon Homelander, and his heat vision braided the air into molten light. It scorched cars and peeled paint and left no mark on the man who hadn't even shifted his weight. The crowd condensed into a single, raw calculus. If you could not wound him, you could still control him, study him, weaponize what you could not break, and every attempt would widen the catastrophe until the city itself answered for it. This is only the beginning, and worse is coming. Listen closely, subscribe if you value seeing what happens next, because what unfolds here does not stay contained, and there will be choices that decide millions. Turn the bell on if you must, but understand this now. Ignoring it will not save you. They found him in the geometry of ruin, standing where a bank and a bodega had once met, and where now the concrete had folded like paper under some invisible thumb, and he looked like a man waiting for the bus, calm to the edge of absent. Vought's first teams arrived with the practiced swagger of people who had never before faced something that refused to be measured, their armored vehicles arranged like chess pieces, while command drones painted him with every sensor known to the company. And behind those drones, the city watched on phones and on the feeds that decided what panic would look like. Homelander descended through a torn sky, as if the skyline itself had opened a door for him, and he landed with the economy of a man who had never learned humility, eyes already narrowing on a target his instinct told him should be broken. Around them, civilians pressed at the perimeter tape with the sticky, helpless curiosity of people willing to watch catastrophe when it was packaged small enough on a screen. Vought's AV-33 scanners sang and spat readouts that changed tone but never meaning. Mass, 0. Impact resistance off the charts. Anomalous response to compound V markers, none. Biological stress, absent. The tactical lead barked demands that sounded like a manual. Containment, observation, non-lethal engagement, and the feed cut between points of view, so executives and pundits could practice the correct kind of alarm. But Saitama simply blinked and asked a question that had the bluntness of someone asking about the weather. And the question itself made the suits fidget because it implied cooperation. Butcher was there on the fringes like a man who had come to a public execution and expected the condemned to be someone else. He spat curses at the camera and at Homelander with identical venom, and when he drew closer on his own terms, he looked not like a threat to Saitama, but like a cynic calculating whether this new anomaly would be useful. Starlight hovered on the periphery with that conflicted softness she was getting used to, and she kept her voice low on calls to mediate with field medics who had no real medics to bring. PR, containment, and who paid for the damage were all things that had to be arranged before the first body was counted, and she hated that calculus. Homelander's first attempt at establishing dominance was a textbook performance. A hover, a tilt of the head, a flare of eyes that made people instinctively step back, and that made cameras buzz because beauty and violence are easy to monetize. He accelerated into a drill of projection, threats shaped like veiled promises, and then he tested a blade of heat at a half-hearted angle to put the man on notice, a little demonstration for the investors watching. The beam struck the air where muscle and bone should have taken it, and the air shimmered. Paint bubbled off nearby cars and a streetlight collapsed, but Saitama didn't flinch, didn't sweat, and made the sort of small, bored sound someone makes when waiting to be offered tea. The failure to damage him was not cinematic in the way Homelander expected. It was banal, as if the world had misfiled the rule that said sups could hurt people, and the banal nature of that failure lodged in Homelander like grit and began to grind. Vought, unwilling to accept a result that didn't fit their models, escalated along the axis they trusted: instrumentation and control. Armored personnel carriers converted into mobile labs, and technicians worked with the sort of surgical focus reserved for people who know their own funding depends on producing data rather than answers. They deployed containment foam that hardened into a honeycomb, remote manipulators with tasers, and drones programmed for 1,000 varieties of non-lethal subjugation. But every tool left Saitama as untouched as a sunbeam passing through glass. Field officers read their protocols aloud like prayers, because procedure is sometimes the only shield people have against the idea that the world might rearrange itself without asking permission. On live feeds, commentators argued over the ethics of experimentation, while politicians in hastily arranged panels promised restraint and decisive action in the same breath. And the result was the coordinated hush of a society rehearsing how to be terrified. There was a moment, thin as glass, when everything looked like it could be contained. Saitama agreed to stand on a sheet of tarpaulin and let a remotely piloted arm brush the back of his head with instruments that recorded only silence, and his acceptance was not grand but small, the sort of bored politeness you use with strangers on a bus. But a containment protocol is a human thing built for other human variables, and human things have edges. A misfired command sent a drone spiraling into a stack of scaffolding, and that scaffold toppled with a slow, inevitable roar toward a row of apartments full of people who had not yet been told to evacuate. Engineers yelled and tried to abort. A technician's hand hovered over a stop key that registered no response because the systems were networked in a way that punished a single point of failure. And the collapse started translating into a sudden, simple arithmetic of crush and fire. When civilian harm became visible, it shifted the geometry of the scene in ways the company could not control. Homelander's face, which until then had been a map of confident lines, rearranged into something tighter and grayer, and you could see doubt wedge into his mouth like a splinter. The tactical commander, on orders from a city hall call where officials tried to appear calm while they cut emergency budgets, authorized live fire suppression to protect personnel and critical infrastructure, because no one trusted their models the way Vought trusted its budget. Butcher, ragged and furious and smelling blood only in the tenor of possibility, moved through the scrum to pull families away from falling glass the way he'd pull people out of a burning bar, and he did it more like a man correcting a small wrong than a savior. Saitama watched the first apartment line begin to smolder and then tilt, and even his mild expression narrowed with an element of attention that in him is like a barely audible gear engaging. What followed was the exact kind of failure Vought had spent millions to avoid, a decision made by someone in a suit to demonstrate control rather than save lives, and the results cascaded in a public, mechanical way. A forward-looking suppression round, not a missile, not yet, but a heavy kinetic device meant to create a buffer, was authorized to land in the space between Saitama and the collapsing apartments, because containment had to look decisive on camera. The round impacted the street with the noise of inevitability. It threw up concrete and dust, and a pattern of shock that pushed the remaining bystanders into a single, desperate scramble. Instead of hitting Saitama, it punched an arc that deflected into the side of a crumbling building. And now the building, already compromised, surrendered more quickly to gravity's patient appetite. Saitama moved then with a speed that was not dramatic. There was no wind, no sound like a film cue, only the clean and dispassionate motion of someone crossing a street, and he placed a hand against the brick of a falling facade as it leapt like a broken animal from its moorings. He did not shout. He did not pose. He simply braced and redirected the mass enough to carve a path through the disaster that saved a dozen people who had been frozen in the worst instant of indecision. Homelander watched that simple, absolute redirection and made a noise that could have been rage or the sound of a mirror cracking, and for the first time, he looked like a man who had discovered an equation in which the answer was not him. Cameras fed everything into the world, and the world rewired its fear instead of its understanding, because you do not have to hurt someone to be threatened by them. You only have to fail to do what you always did. By the time medics crawled into the cleared space, the narrative had already moved. Saitama was standing in the dust with a few fresh creases in the sleeve of his shirt and no blood on his hands, and the camera operators had found their new story. He had intervened, but he had not been hurt, and for Vought that reality presented not relief but a problem requiring immediate systemic response. Homelander hovered, collapsing the air around him with an intensity that made even his allies step back, and his mouth moved without forming words while his mind, which had always assumed the world conformed to his force, thudded against a wall it could not crush. The tactical commander radioed for a hard lockdown and for a level of secrecy that would wrap the incident in legal and ethical darkness. And at that exact breath, a command came down from the corporate line: escalate containment, deny access, and schedule an executive briefing. The escalation that followed was not yet global, but it was irreversible in the simplest human way. Choices had been made on the public record, and they would ripple regardless of whether they were wise. Vought ordered a containment dome to seal parts of the district, and as the dome's skeleton hissed into place, the cameras caught faces pressed against the other side, and those faces would not forget the look of being quarantined for someone else's mystery. Homelander began to circle higher with a restless energy that had the feel of a predator packing a caged edge, and Butcher, watching from a makeshift media shadow, spat one word at a camera, a prayer disguised as a curse, while the feeds multiplied what it meant. On a separate channel, an executive in a suit finalized the authorization for a pre-planned kinetic-capable device to be brought in as an additional measure, and the acceptance echoed like a bell. The scene closed on motion already set. Vought's armored transports arrayed in tighter rings, drones calibrating for a different class of test, Homelander's ascent to the clouds with the look of a god who had noticed his own doubt, and Saitama standing quietly in the center with a mildness that felt like an unreadable order. There was no blood, no measurable strain, and no way to reduce the evening to a report that would reassure a shaken public. Instead, there was a list of decisions and their consequences, and the first of them had begun to fall. The city exhaled into an altered night that would not fit the categories it used to understand itself, and everyone who could change course chose, at that moment, instead to steer the ship harder. By the time the second ring of Vought vehicles locked into place around the district, the tone of the operation had shifted from cautious observation to something that looked uncomfortably like a live demonstration, and everyone involved understood that the audience had grown far beyond the street. The containment dome hummed at a pitch most civilians could feel in their teeth, and the evacuation corridors were now choked with people who had realized too late that this was not a publicity stunt that would end with a handshake. Saitama stood where they had asked him to stand because moving him had become a political risk rather than a tactical one, and when a Vought liaison approached with a tablet and a careful smile, he nodded with the mild politeness of someone agreeing to wait in line. Starlight, who had stayed on site despite corporate pressure to return to a more photogenic role, watched the growing apparatus of tests assemble with a dread she could not explain to the cameras without losing her job. Vought's science division had moved a mobile impact rig into the dome under armed escort, a piece of hardware designed for controlled stress testing of SUPs, whose durability had previously been considered a bragging point. They explained to city officials over a secure call that this would be a non-invasive calibration meant to establish baselines, because the words non-invasive and baseline traveled better through legal departments than anything that sounded like force. A remote arm extended towards Saitama's shoulder with a sensor cluster that had once measured Homelander's resistance to high-velocity debris, and when the device made contact, the readout displayed the same empty consistency it had shown before. Technicians recalibrated with growing impatience, layering protocols that had been written for other bodies and other miracles, but the numbers refused to budge from their quiet refusal. Homelander returned to the ground with a visible effort at composure that fooled no one who had seen him hesitate earlier, and he took up a position close enough to be felt as a pressure rather than seen as a symbol. He addressed Saitama with the smooth menace of a man accustomed to setting terms, suggesting cooperation as if it were a privilege he could grant. And when Saitama replied with a small okay that carried no fear, the exchange landed like a public slight. Cameras drank in the moment because it had all the ingredients of a confrontation that could be cut into a segment, and Vought's PR team quietly encouraged the angle. Butcher watched from a temporary command post that smelled of sweat and hot plastic, and he found himself less interested in Homelander's threats than in the way Saitama's boredom seemed to absorb them without effort. The first formal test began with a kinetic ram set to a fraction of its maximum output, the kind of force that had previously staggered A-Train in a training mishap that never made the news. The ram extended and struck Saitama's forearm with a clean, mechanical confidence, and the impact traveled through the device into the mounting rig with a shudder that suggested success to the untrained eye. On the screen, however, the displacement graph remained a flat line, and the pressure sensors recorded a return that suggested the ram had encountered an immovable wall rather than living tissue. Engineers exchanged glances that were less about surprise and more about the way their assumptions were now publicly incorrect. Vought escalated in the way institutions do when embarrassed, incrementally, with a language that made each increase sound like the previous one. The rig stepped up through a series of impacts that would have snapped bone in most registered SUPs, and when that produced no change, they introduced a resonance test meant to disrupt internal structures without visible trauma. The dome's hum deepened as a subsonic wave passed through Saitama and into the street beneath him, cracking a line in the asphalt that snaked toward an empty storefront. And for a second, the crowd beyond the barrier leaned back as if expecting something to give. Saitama tilted his head, more curious than concerned, and asked if they were almost done because the noise was a little annoying. Homelander interpreted the question as defiance and stepped forward with a public impatience that made his cape snap in the artificial wind of the dome's generators, and he placed himself between the rig and its subject with a proprietary stance that had always worked before. He proposed a demonstration that would reassure the city, framing it as a safety measure, and Vought's command hesitated for the length of a breath before authorizing what they could later call a collaborative assessment. The cameras were repositioned with the speed of professionals who understood that this would be the clip that set the narrative for weeks. Starlight began to protest into a headset that had already gone silent on her channel. Homelander's heat vision lashed out in a controlled beam that carved a line across the pavement at Saitama's feet before lifting to meet his chest, and the air between them bloomed into a haze of thermal distortion that made the feed look painterly. The beam lingered, not long enough to be called reckless but long enough to be called a test, and when it faded, Saitama's expression had not changed in any meaningful way. The lack of resistance was worse than any show of strength could have been, because it implied not a contest but an absence of one, and Homelander's jaw tightened with the effort of interpreting it as anything else. A murmur moved through the staff that had the tone of people witnessing a violation of etiquette rather than physics. At the edge of the dome, a city emergency coordinator received an update that the hospital grid 2 blocks over was experiencing intermittent failures, likely due to the resonance test's bleed into infrastructure, and she relayed the information with a steadiness learned in disasters that did not usually involve capes. Vought's liaison requested a pause that the executive line denied, citing the need to conclude the demonstration before public confidence eroded further, and the words "public confidence" hung in the air like a smell. Butcher heard the exchange through a cracked speaker and made a decision to move his people closer to the evacuation corridors, because someone had to account for the way demonstrations tend to become accidents. The irreversible escalation came disguised as a safeguard when Vought authorized the deployment of a magnetically guided restraint frame designed to immobilize even the strongest registered SUPs without direct harm. The frame unfolded from a transport with insect precision and locked into the street around Saitama, its articulated limbs humming with the promise of non-lethal control. As it engaged, a power surge from the strained grid rippled through the dome systems, and one of the frame's anchors misfired into a support strut that had been holding a section of the evacuation walkway above the crowd. The strut failed with a brittle crack that traveled faster than any order to stop. The walkway began to sag under the weight of civilians who had not yet cleared the corridor, and the sag became a tilt that would soon become a fall into a lane now cluttered with equipment and fuel. Starlight shouted for a shutdown that could not propagate through the networked controls in time, and Homelander turned with a reflex that was almost admirable before it collided with the truth of what he could not do here. Saitama looked from the frame's closing limbs to the shifting mass of people and metal, and the decision that followed was not theatrical but immediate. He stepped out of the half-engaged restraints as if leaving a crowded subway car, and the frame closed on empty air with a whine that sounded like a complaint. In the same motion, he reached the failing walkway and supported it with one hand while technicians scrambled to cut power, and the tilt arrested in a way that suggested the street had briefly decided to be kinder. Homelander watched that simple intervention and felt the doubt he had been holding at bay move into something hotter, while Vought's command line ordered a full containment lockdown to prevent further variables from interfering. Beyond the dome, the city's feeds began to loop the moment when the restraint had closed on nothing, and the narrative changed in a way that could not be walked back. Inside, the pre-planned kinetic-capable device arrived at the perimeter under a tarped escort, and the order to prepare it moved through the chain of command with the calm of a decision already made. By midnight, the story had outgrown the district and begun to metastasize into boardrooms where men and women who had never set foot in a containment dome rehearsed the language of responsibility with the same care they reserved for earnings calls. Vought Tower lit up floor by floor as emergency sessions were convened under the pretext of risk mitigation, and the executive wing moved with a practiced calm that belied the speed at which legal frameworks were being drafted to redefine what the public had just seen. Ashley Barrett stood at the head of a conference table that had been designed to intimidate dissent, and she listened to a live relay from the field where technicians described a subject who cooperated with testing and could not be made to register harm. The words cooperated and could not created a gap that marketing could not bridge, and for a moment the room was quiet in a way that meant money was at stake. Stan Edgar's absence was felt in the way gravity is felt when it changes, and when he joined via secure link, his voice arrived with the patient authority of someone who believed that problems were merely poorly managed assets. He did not ask whether Saitama could be hurt, because the field had answered that in public. Instead, he asked how cooperation could be formalized, how the appearance of consent might be preserved, and how a narrative could be constructed that positioned Vought as the steward of a resource rather than the jailer of an anomaly. Legal counsel outlined emergency memoranda that would reclassify the incident as a public health matter, allowing the company to operate under frameworks that limited oversight while expanding jurisdiction. Public Relations drafted a statement that used the word partnership 3 times and avoided the word containment entirely. Back in the dome, Saitama sat on an overturned crate because someone had asked him to wait while they arranged the next phase, and he accepted a bottle of water from a junior tech who looked like he had never spoken to anyone not on a payroll. The tech explained, with the nervous precision of someone reciting a manual, that the company would like to run a series of harmless scans to better understand his capabilities for the sake of civilian safety. Saitama nodded and asked if it would take long because he had planned to pick up groceries, and the question made its way through the command channel with the weight of a joke no one wanted to laugh at. Starlight heard it and felt the situation tilt again, because boredom was not an emotion their protocols had accounted for. Homelander, who had been instructed to maintain a visible presence, took up a hovering patrol that allowed him to be seen from every angle, and the cameras followed with a devotion that was almost religious. His attempts to reassert control came in the form of proximity and posture rather than force, because force had betrayed him in a way he could not publicly admit. He addressed the assembled staff with a low directive about maintaining order and respecting corporate guidance, and the words landed with less certainty than they had in the morning. Butcher, watching the feeds from a commandeered van, recognized the performance for what it was, and began to suspect that the real fight would not be against Saitama at all, but against the machinery now spinning up to claim him. Vought's Science Division proposed a voluntary relocation to a controlled facility outside the city, framing it as a comfort measure that would reduce strain on local infrastructure and provide amenities not available in the field. Ashley approved the proposal with a caveat that it be presented as an option rather than a directive, and a liaison was dispatched with a smile calibrated for trust. Saitama listened to the pitch and asked whether there would be air conditioning, because the dome's hum had made the night feel warm, and when the liaison assured him there would be, he agreed to the move with the same politeness he had shown earlier. The agreement was immediately converted into a legal document by people who understood that consent, once captured, could be used to justify almost anything. The irreversible escalation came not from Saitama's cooperation, but from the way the city reacted to the transfer. Emergency services reported that rumors of an indestructible man being moved under guard had begun to draw crowds along the planned route, and municipal leaders demanded additional security that Vought was eager to provide. A convoy was assembled with armored transports, surveillance drones, and a magnetically shielded carrier that had never before been used outside a lab, and its presence alone suggested a threat that official statements denied. The mayor's office authorized a temporary curfew in adjacent neighborhoods, citing infrastructure concerns, and the language of governance shifted from reassurance to restriction in the span of an hour. As the convoy prepared to roll, Starlight attempted to secure an independent observer status for the transfer, and was politely refused on the grounds of operational integrity, a phrase that had been weaponized in meetings she was not invited to attend. Homelander volunteered to escort from above, and Ashley accepted because his image would soothe investors even if it unsettled the public. Butcher made calls to contacts in the city who could divert foot traffic away from choke points, because he had seen what happened when demonstrations met crowds. Saitama climbed into the carrier without complaint, ducking his head out of habit rather than necessity, and asked if anyone knew a good supermarket near the facility. The convoy moved into streets that had been hastily cleared by police, whose authority now overlapped with a corporation's mandate, and the drones mapped rooftops for anything that could be interpreted as interference. Along the route, people held up phones and signs and questions that could not be answered by the statements already drafted, and the sight of the carrier made the abstract incident suddenly physical. A hospital administrator called into a city line to report that power fluctuations were continuing, and the coordinator traced them back to the dome's sustained draw, which would remain active until the transfer was complete. The choice to maintain containment during movement was made for safety, and it would strain the grid in ways that had not been budgeted. Halfway to the expressway, a substation tripped under the compounded load, and a neighborhood went dark in a way that turned curiosity into fear with immediate effect. Traffic lights failed at an intersection the convoy was about to cross, and a bus that had been waved through by an officer entered the junction at the wrong moment, its driver blinded by the carrier's floodlights. The lead vehicle swerved to avoid a collision and clipped a barricade that had been set up to manage onlookers, sending it into a line of fuel drums staged for construction. The drums toppled and ruptured, and the spill found an ignition source in the form of a hot exhaust manifold. Fire moved with the confidence of something that understands oxygen, and the nearest evacuation corridor was suddenly a hazard rather than a solution. Command channels filled with overlapping orders to reroute, to contain, to protect the asset, and the phrase, "protect the asset," was repeated enough times that it began to sound like a prayer. Inside the carrier, Saitama felt the vehicle slow and asked if they were there yet, and no one answered because the answer was becoming complicated. Above, Homelander angled down with a frustration he could not discharge into the man he was meant to escort. The event was already in motion when Vought authorized the activation of the carrier's magnetic lockdown to prevent any interference from reaching its occupant, a decision that would trap the convoy in a narrowing pocket of flame while prioritizing containment over mobility. On a separate line, Ashley approved the deployment of a rapid response suppression team, equipped with heavier options that had been waiting for a justification, and the justification now had a time stamp. The fire did not stay polite enough to burn only what Vought had budgeted to replace, and as it crawled along the spilled fuel and found new purchase in the clutter of a city built on convenience, the convoy's problems became the district's problems with a speed that no press release could slow. Traffic cameras that had once been used to optimize commute times now showed intersections dissolving into confused knots of stalled cars and people on foot, and the carrier's magnetic lockdown turned it into the center of a storm that could not be driven through. Saitama felt the vehicle settle into a stop and leaned forward to peer through a narrow slit in the reinforced plating, asking in a tone of mild curiosity whether something had broken. The technician opposite him swallowed and began to explain that a brief delay was expected, which was the sort of lie designed to be true for at least a minute. Outside, emergency responders attempted to carve a perimeter through heat that distorted distance and made commands sound farther away than they were, and the suppression team that Ashley had authorized arrived with equipment whose presence suggested a new phase rather than a solution. Starlight forced her way past a line of private security to reach the nearest operations console, arguing that the convoy needed mobility more than containment now, and her protest was logged with a timestamp that would later matter to someone in legal. Homelander hovered low enough to feel the fire's updraft, and his eyes tracked the carrier with a possessiveness that had become difficult to distinguish from fear. Butcher's van crawled along a service road toward the intersection, and he began to realize that the corporate response would always choose the asset over the crowd unless someone made that choice impossible. Vought's command made the calculation that if the lockdown were lifted prematurely, any interference could compromise the subject and escalate the situation further, and so they held the magnetic seals while directing local units to manage the blaze. The grid, already strained by the dome's sustained draw, began to shed additional load in neighborhoods far from the original incident, and the blackout spread with the quiet inevitability of a policy decision. Elevators halted between floors in high-rises whose residents had been told this would remain contained, and hospitals switched to backup generators that had not been tested for a night like this. The city's emergency coordinator moved from one crisis to another on a headset that crackled with the friction of too many priorities. When the first fuel drum detonated with a concussive thump that sent a sheet of flame across the convoy's flank, the justification for heavier options wrote itself in the margins of a situation report. Ashley authorized the deployment of a high-capacity suppression foam designed for industrial fires, and the team began to blanket the intersection in a chemical snow that made the asphalt look like winter had arrived out of season. The foam cooled what it touched, but also turned the street into a slick hazard that sent responders sliding into the path of collapsing scaffolds already weakened by heat. Starlight watched a firefighter go down and felt the tilt again, because this was no longer about understanding a man who could not be hurt. Inside the carrier, the temperature dropped as the foam's chill found its way through the vents, and Saitama rubbed his arms with a small, absent motion that suggested discomfort rather than danger. He asked if opening the door would help, and the technician explained that the lockdown was necessary for safety, which sounded different now that safety meant something else. Homelander landed atop the carrier with a heavy grace that made the roof flex, and he addressed the command channel with a directive to maintain control at all costs. The phrase, "at all costs," traveled outward into a city that was already paying. The irreversible escalation arrived when a secondary substation failed under the compounded load of suppression systems and emergency reroutes, and a section of the elevated rail line lost power with a train still crossing above the intersection. The train ground to a halt with a scream that cut through the sirens, and its sudden stop shifted weight onto a support that had been compromised by the initial blast. Engineers on a remote feed shouted warnings that the load-bearing tolerance had been exceeded, and the support began to deform in a way that could not be reversed with orders. Butcher saw the tilt from the service road and began to run before he had a plan. Vought's command faced a choice that would not look like 1 in the morning: maintain the lockdown to protect the subject, or release it to allow immediate assistance that could reduce civilian harm. Legal advised that releasing the lockdown could expose the company to liability if the subject moved unpredictably, and the advice was noted with the speed of a decision already favored. Starlight demanded a manual override and was told that the system did not support local control under current authorization levels, which meant that the authority to change course existed 3 floors above a conference table. The train's support gave another centimeter that felt like a mile. Saitama listened to the metal above complain and then go quiet in the way structures do before they fail, and he tapped the carrier's inner wall as if knocking on a door. When no one responded, he reached for the handle that the magnetic field was meant to hold in place, and found it resistant in the way most things were. The carrier's seals hummed with a confidence borrowed from engineering models that had never included him, and outside, Homelander's gaze flicked from the train to the man he could not move. The crowd on the elevated line began to understand what a blackout meant when it happened in the wrong place. The support's final failure was already beginning when Ashley's office received a call from a city council member whose district included the rail line, and the language of partnership finally collided with the language of votes. Authorization to disengage, the lockdown moved through the chain with a speed that had not been available earlier, and the carrier's magnetic field began to wind down in increments designed to protect delicate equipment rather than lives. Foam hissed, sirens rose, and the train's leading car dipped with a slow, awful grace. By the time the carrier's magnetic seals began their reluctant disengagement, the city had already crossed a line from corporate incident to national concern, and the call that connected Vought's executive floor to a federal operations center carried with it the authority of people who could make the night much louder. The Department of Defense liaison did not ask whether Saitama could be injured, because that question had been answered in public twice now. Instead, he asked what assurances existed that the subject could be contained if he chose not to cooperate once the lockdown lifted. Ashley replied with a confidence borrowed from the earlier agreement to relocate, emphasizing voluntary compliance and the ongoing cooperation that had characterized every interaction so far. The liaison listened and authorized a precautionary deployment that would bring uniformed personnel into a situation previously managed by brand guidelines. On the elevated rail, the leading car continued its careful descent toward a tilt that would become a fall, and passengers pressed themselves against windows that now reflected only smoke and the strobe of emergency lights below. Starlight shouted into a channel that had finally opened for manual override, urging immediate release so that assistance could be provided before gravity made the decision for them, and a technician began the last step of the shutdown with hands that did not stop shaking. Homelander watched the train with an expression that had begun to calcify into something less like control and more like calculation, because he understood that any visible failure would not be blamed on engineering. Butcher reached the base of the support and found responders already trying to erect a temporary brace with materials that would not be enough. The carrier's door released with a hiss that sounded almost apologetic, and Saitama stepped into a street made slick by foam and ash with the same small, practical care he would use on a wet kitchen floor. He looked up at the sagging rail line, then at the responders who were trying to solve a problem measured in seconds with tools designed for hours, and asked where they wanted him. No one answered quickly enough because the command structure had not rehearsed how to request help from the asset it had just tried to immobilize, and the delay stretched into something dangerous. Above, Homelander descended with the intent to interpose himself, as if proximity might restore the hierarchy that had always been there. Saitama moved past him without comment, not in defiance, but because there was no time to negotiate a lane, and he reached the failing support in the quiet way he had reached the walkway earlier. He placed his hand against the warped steel and applied just enough force to arrest the tilt, and the leading car steadied with a motion that made the passengers stumble but not fall. Responders froze for a heartbeat and then resumed their work with a speed born of relief, shoring up what they could now that the load had been shifted. Homelander hovered a meter away and said nothing, because the cameras were still watching. The irreversible escalation arrived in the form of rotor wash that blew the foam into drifting waves, announcing the arrival of military helicopters authorized under the liaison's precautionary order. Their presence turned a corporate convoy into a joint operation by the simple fact of uniforms, and the rules governing force shifted in ways that would take lawyers weeks to parse. A ground commander established a temporary perimeter that overlapped with Vought, and the negotiation over who was in charge happened in tones too low for microphones, but loud enough to shape outcomes. The sight of soldiers in the glow of a city fire made the incident feel like something the country had practiced for. Vought's command requested that the military limit its engagement to crowd control and infrastructure support, citing the subject's cooperation and the need to avoid antagonizing a situation that had not yet become hostile. The ground commander agreed in principle while positioning a rapid reaction unit with equipment that had been designed for hardened targets rather than public streets, because precaution had a way of becoming policy once deployed. Starlight moved between responders, coordinating evacuations from the rail cars now that the immediate risk had been stabilized, and she caught sight of Saitama holding the support with an absent patience that made the act look trivial. Butcher watched from below and understood that the presence of soldiers would not make the company more careful. Inside Vought Tower, Stan Edgar instructed legal to prepare a memorandum of understanding that would preserve corporate primacy over the subject's handling while acknowledging federal support, a document that would allow both sides to claim responsibility without surrendering control. Ashley signed with a pen that left a thin groove in the paper, and the act committed the company to a partnership it could not easily dissolve. The liaison approved the staging of additional assets on the outskirts of the city, emphasizing that they were not to be used unless cooperation ceased. The definition of cessation would become the night's most important argument. At the rail line, the last passengers were guided off with the care usually reserved for miracles, and Saitama asked if he could let go now that the braces were in place. An engineer nodded too quickly, and when he removed his hand, the structure held with a groan that suggested it might remember the favor later. Homelander touched down beside him and attempted to frame the intervention as part of a coordinated response, but the words felt like a translation no one needed. The helicopters banked into holding patterns that traced anxious circles over the district. As the fire receded under the foam's slow suffocation, the military perimeter expanded by a block to accommodate arriving units, and with it came a new set of protocols that placed civilians farther from the center. Vought authorized the resumption of the transfer once the route could be secured, and the carrier's systems began to power back up with the intent to move. On a separate channel, The ground commander requested permission to bring in a non-lethal area denial system as a contingency should cooperation falter, and the request was granted with the note that its deployment would be a last resort. The convoy reformed under joint escort, and the city watched uniforms and capes share a lane as if it had always been meant to be that way. Saitama climbed back into the carrier when asked, because it seemed easier than arguing, and asked if they would pass a supermarket on the way. No one answered, because the route had just been altered to avoid a protest that had gathered 2 blocks ahead. The altered route did not stay secret long enough to matter, because by now the transfer had become a moving headline, and the world had begun to watch in a way that made local decisions feel provincial. International news desks cut into scheduled programming with footage of a joint corporate military convoy inching through a blackout, and analysts who had spent careers discussing deterrence now found themselves discussing cooperation with a man who could not be made to register harm. Vought's communications team issued a statement emphasizing voluntary relocation and civilian safety, while a State Department spokesperson confirmed that federal support had been requested as a precaution rather than a necessity. The distinction was meant to reassure allies and markets in equal measure, and it satisfied neither. Inside the carrier, Saitama leaned back against a seat that had been designed for someone larger in ego if not in frame, and he asked again whether this would take long because the noise made it hard to think. The technician assigned to monitor environmental systems explained that the facility was less than an hour away under current conditions, and that the air conditioning there would be excellent. Saitama nodded with the same mild acceptance he had shown all night, because the presence of soldiers had not changed the terms in his mind. He did not treat the convoy as dangerous unless someone else was at risk, and for the moment, the risk was moving around him rather than toward him. Above the rooftops, Homelander escorted with a vigilance that had become brittle, scanning for threats he could not define because the threat had never before been his own impotence. He attempted to coordinate with the ground commander over an encrypted line, framing his presence as a stabilizing factor for public morale, and the commander acknowledged with a professionalism that did not defer. Starlight rode in a separate transport, having secured observer status through a call that bypassed Ashley's office and reached a council member still staring at the rail line footage. Butcher's van trailed 2 blocks back, close enough to respond if the next accident chose a different shape. The irreversible escalation began in a room thousands of miles away, where a foreign defense ministry interpreted the footage not as a local anomaly, but as a strategic variable. If Vought could not make the man bleed, and the U.S. military had joined the response, then the man was no longer a corporate problem but a potential global asset, and the calculus of advantage shifted accordingly. A request for clarification was sent through diplomatic channels with the politeness of a warning, and a satellite tasked to weather patterns was retasked to observe the convoy's thermal signature. Markets reacted with a tremor that had nothing to do with fire. Back in the city, the ground commander received updated rules of engagement that included contingencies for electromagnetic area denial should cooperation cease during transit, and he positioned a vehicle equipped with the system at the front of the convoy. Vought objected on the grounds that introducing additional variables could complicate voluntary compliance, but the objection was noted and overruled with language that referenced national security. Starlight listened to the exchange and understood that the definition of cooperation was about to become narrower. Homelander's reply was a thin agreement that did not mask his irritation. A protest that had gathered along the previous route reformed ahead of the convoy's new path, drawn by rumors and live streams that promised proximity to history. Police attempted to disperse the crowd with the patience of people who knew patience would not last, and the sight of soldiers hardened the lines into something less negotiable. The electromagnetic system was brought to standby to protect the convoy from potential drone interference, and its hum began to interfere with nearby medical devices, in ways that would later be described as unintended. An ambulance stalled at the curb, with a patient inside whose monitor had just gone dark. Starlight argued for a temporary shutdown to allow emergency services to pass, and the ground commander requested confirmation that doing so would not invite interference that could compromise the subject. Vought's liaison advised maintaining the field, citing the proximity of the protest and the risk of escalation if the carrier were approached, and the advice traveled up a chain that valued certainty over compassion. Butcher saw the ambulance from his rearview mirror and began to push forward, because the line between precaution and harm had been crossed again. The convoy did not stop. Inside, Saitama felt the carrier slow as the electromagnetic system adjusted output to compensate for a surge, and he asked if the air conditioner was working, because it felt a little stuffy. The technician assured him that the facility would be better, and Saitama accepted the reassurance without complaint. He did not treat the testing as dangerous, because the danger had always been directed outward, and he would escalate only when innocent lives were threatened. Outside, the protest began to chant in a rhythm that made decision-making harder. The Foreign Ministry's second message arrived with less politeness, requesting assurances that the subject would not be deployed beyond U.S. borders without consultation, and the phrasing implied consequences if those assurances could not be given. In response, a Pentagon official authorized the prepositioning of additional assets at the facility as a demonstration of internal control, and the order moved through a network that did not include Vought's marketing department. The facility's gates opened for a convoy that had become a symbol, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. As the vehicles approached the perimeter, the electromagnetic system registered an anomaly in the crowd behind them, a cluster of devices attempting to interface with the convoy's network, and the ground commander ordered an increase in output to prevent intrusion. The field expanded by a margin that brought it into contact with the ambulance's backup systems, and the engine died with a cough that sounded small against the helicopters overhead. The next decision was already forming when the facility's outer doors began to close. The facility's outer doors sealed with a hydraulic certainty that sounded, to the people outside, like a verdict, and the convoy slipped into a courtyard designed for assets that had never needed persuasion. Inside the perimeter, floodlights turned night into a controlled laboratory of shadow and glare, and uniformed personnel took up positions that suggested a threat had been admitted even if it had not been declared. Saitama stepped down from the carrier when asked, because it seemed like the polite thing to do after being given a ride, and he looked around with a mild curiosity that did not register the way the rifles tracked his movement. Starlight arrived moments later under escort, her observer status converted into a badge that opened some doors and closed others. Vought's Science Division wasted no time reframing cooperation into procedure, guiding Saitama toward a testing hall whose walls had been layered with materials chosen for their ability to absorb and record rather than restrain. The lead researcher introduced herself with a steadiness learned from years of handling volatile personalities, and she explained that the next phase would involve non-invasive evaluations to better ensure civilian safety during any future incidents. Saitama nodded and asked whether this would interfere with his plans later, because he still needed groceries, and the question rippled through the observation deck with an almost comic dissonance. Ashley watched from behind the glass and instructed PR to capture the moment for internal use only. Homelander positioned himself in the hall with a proprietary stillness that had become his preferred response to uncertainty, and he suggested a demonstration that would confirm, once and for all, the subject's resistance under controlled conditions. The researcher hesitated long enough to make it clear that the suggestion had not originated in the protocol, and then she adapted it into a comparative assessment that would reassure federal partners. The ground commander approved with a caveat that any test must avoid collateral risk, and the definition of risk was now narrower than the hallway they stood in. Butcher, having found a way into a maintenance corridor, listened to the exchange through a vent that carried more than air. The test began with Homelander's heat vision at a distance measured to prevent reflection into observation ports, and the beam struck Saitama's shoulder with a familiar bloom of thermal haze that left the man's shirt untroubled. Instruments registered nothing beyond the room's baseline hum, and the researcher called for a pause that Homelander ignored for a second longer than was appropriate. The extra second did not produce a result, and the cameras in the ceiling captured the way his mouth tightened when the beam died. Saitama shifted his weight to relieve a mild annoyance and asked if that was it. Resistance emerged not from Saitama, but from the people now tasked with reconciling data that refused to fit policy. A junior analyst flagged that repeated demonstrations in the presence of military observers could shift the subject's status from cooperative civilian to strategic resource under certain interpretations of federal code, and the flag moved up a chain that had not been briefed for that outcome. Ashley instructed legal to prepare language that preserved voluntary framing, while the ground commander requested that further demonstrations be limited until jurisdiction could be clarified. Homelander heard the word limit and interpreted it as a personal constraint. The irreversible escalation arrived in the form of a live feed routed, by error or intent, to an international monitoring body that had been tracking the incident since the convoy left the city. The footage showed Homelander's beam striking Saitama without effect under joint supervision, and the implication was not lost on anyone with a satellite and an interest. A message from an allied government arrived within minutes requesting immediate transparency on the subject's capabilities and status, and the Pentagon's reply promised a briefing that Vought had not authorized. Markets moved again in a way that made Ashley's assistant pale. Starlight moved to intervene, suggesting that continued demonstrations would only inflame perceptions that the subject was being evaluated for deployment rather than safety, and her argument found an ally in the ground commander's risk assessment. The researcher called for a shift to environmental scans, which Saitama accepted with a small sigh of relief because the noise had been getting to him. Homelander stepped back with a smile calibrated for cameras that were no longer local, and the smile did not reach his eyes. Butcher made a note of the maintenance access points that led to the testing hall. Outside the hall, a protest had formed beyond the facility's perimeter, drawn by the same rumors that had followed the convoy, and the electromagnetic system that had stalled the ambulance was brought online to prevent drone intrusion. Its field lapped at the fence line and began to interfere with pacemakers in a crowd that had not been screened, and medical staff on standby reported incidents with a calm that masked urgency. The ground commander requested a reduction in output, and Vought's liaison advised maintaining the field until the international feed could be secured. The choice settled into the room like dust. Inside, Saitama watched a display that showed his outline without variance and asked whether they were almost done, because he could hear sirens again. No one answered quickly enough, because the next decision was being debated in a room where dominance had begun to look like liability. On a secure line, authorization was requested to classify the facility as a temporary strategic site, a change that would bring different rules to bear on everyone inside. The request was granted as the perimeter lights flickered. The classification change did not arrive with sirens or a speech, but it altered the way every order would be interpreted from that moment forward, and the facility's internal network reflected the shift with a cascade of new permissions that none of the scientists had asked for. Doors that had previously opened with a badge now required a secondary authorization, and the testing hall's observation deck filled with uniformed personnel whose presence made the research feel like an afterthought. Saitama sat on a low bench while environmental scanners passed over him with the gentleness of a medical exam, and he asked whether this would take much longer because he could hear more sirens outside than before. The lead researcher assured him that they were almost finished, and her voice carried the thin strain of someone who knew that finished had become a moving target. Starlight received an update that medical incidents were rising beyond the fence line, as the electromagnetic field continued to interfere with implanted devices, and she relayed the information to the ground commander with a request for immediate reduction. The commander agreed in principle and moved to issue the order, but Vought's liaison interjected with a reminder that the international feed was still unsecured, and that any perceived lapse in control could invite interference. Homelander listened to the exchange from the far side of the hall and felt the argument slip away from anything he could dominate with presence alone. Butcher, crouched in a maintenance crawlspace, watched a nurse attempt to stabilize a protester through the fence and understood that resistance would not come from the man on the bench. The irreversible escalation arrived when a drone, unauthorized and clumsy, struck the perimeter netting in an attempt to capture footage for a feed that would pay for someone's rent. The electromagnetic system spiked in response, expanding its field to compensate for what it read as an intrusion, and the increase propagated into the crowd with immediate consequence. A man in the front line collapsed, then another, and the medical staff's calm broke into triage with a speed that made the incident visible even from the observation deck. Starlight shouted for shutdown in a voice that carried beyond her clearance level. Inside the hall, Saitama tilted his head as the sirens outside changed pitch, and he asked what was happening because it sounded like someone needed help. The researcher hesitated, because the new classification had shifted the responsibility for answers away from her and toward a chain of command that was now debating optics. Homelander stepped forward as if to reassert the hierarchy, suggesting that the subject remain where he was while the situation outside was managed by professionals. The suggestion sounded less like authority than like a plea. Saitama stood because sitting had begun to feel inconvenient, and he walked toward the exit with the same mild purpose he had shown at the rail line. Security moved to intercept out of habit rather than belief, and the ground commander ordered them to stand down before anyone made a mistake that would be remembered. Starlight met Saitama at the threshold and told him that people outside were having medical emergencies and that the field was part of the problem. He nodded once, because this was the condition under which he would escalate. The field's control unit sat in a vehicle near the fence, its status lights blinking in a rhythm that meant everything was working as designed, and the technicians assigned to it were arguing with a supervisor over whether a manual reduction would violate the new site classification. Butcher reached the same vehicle from the other side and found himself facing a decision that would trade corporate protocol for immediate harm reduction, and he chose without ceremony. He cut power with a tool meant for bolts, and the electromagnetic hum died with a sigh that sounded like relief. Outside, medical monitors flickered back to life, and responders moved with a renewed urgency that came from hope rather than habit. Inside, alarms registered the field's failure and routed a fault report to a command desk that now had authority to interpret it as sabotage. Homelander turned toward the door with a fury that had found a safer target than Saitama, and the ground commander requested confirmation before any response that might escalate further. Ashley's office received the fault report and authorized an investigation that would begin with the assumption of hostile intent. Saitama stepped into the courtyard and looked toward the fence where people were being lowered onto stretchers, and he asked if there was anything he could do to help. No one answered immediately, because the next order was already being drafted to lock down the facility against internal threats. The outer doors began to close again, this time to keep someone in rather than something out. The second lockdown carried a different intent than the first, and everyone inside the courtyard understood it in the way people understand when a room has decided on a culprit before asking questions. The outer doors began to seal with a hydraulic insistence that would keep the protest, the medics, and the consequences at bay, and the command desk's fault report had already reclassified the field failure as an internal compromise. Soldiers moved with a cohesion that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with training, and the facility's public address system instructed all non-essential personnel to remain in place while an investigation commenced. Saitama looked from the closing doors to the stretchers beyond the fence and asked whether they were going to help the people who had just collapsed. Homelander stepped into the center of the courtyard with a posture that read as control to anyone who needed it to, and he addressed the assembled staff with a directive to secure the subject until the sabotage could be assessed. The word secure landed with an authority that had always worked before, and the ground commander felt the weight of a partnership that had just become a jurisdictional puzzle. Starlight moved toward the fence again, only to be stopped by a line of security whose orders had updated without her clearance. Butcher slipped from the control vehicle's shadow and disappeared into a service stairwell that led back toward the testing hall. Vought's liaison requested permission to initiate a non-lethal area denial protocol within the courtyard to prevent further interference, and the ground commander approved with a caveat that it not impede emergency access beyond the fence. The system came online with a hum that raised the hair on forearms, and its patterning was designed to discourage movement through discomfort rather than harm. Saitama felt the air thicken in a way that suggested annoyance rather than danger, and he shifted his stance to keep his balance on the slick foam that had not yet dried. He did not treat the field as a threat, because the threat was still the people on stretchers outside. The irreversible escalation arrived when a misrouted command sent the denial field into an overlapping pattern with the facility's structural dampeners, creating a resonance that traveled through the courtyard and into the testing hall's reinforced walls. Monitors in the observation deck began to spike, and a support brace in an adjacent wing reported stress levels beyond its tolerance. Engineers shouted into headsets that the interference could compromise the hall if sustained, and the order to reduce output stalled at a desk that had been instructed to prioritize containment over convenience. Homelander looked toward Saitama as if expecting him to be the cause. Inside the hall, glass panels began to craze in delicate patterns that suggested a failure still negotiating its shape, and personnel moved to evacuate equipment that had been calibrated for a different night. Starlight felt the floor's vibration through her boots and understood that the courtyard's problem had just become the building, and she relayed the update to anyone who would listen. The ground commander ordered a partial shutdown that took too long to propagate through systems now arguing with each other. Outside the fence, medics watched the facility lights flicker and did not know why. Saitama stepped toward the hall when a section of its outer wall gave a small, brittle sigh, and security moved again out of reflex. Homelander intercepted with a hand raised as if to halt a tide, and he told Saitama to remain where he was while professionals addressed the structural issue. The words sounded rehearsed and were met with a quiet look that had no contempt in it, only impatience. Saitama glanced at the stretchers once more, and then back at the wall that had begun to deform. When the first panel failed and a cascade of reinforced glass followed it into the corridor beyond, the denial field's hum climbed into a whine that set teeth on edge. The resonance had found a frequency that the dampeners could not cancel, and the stress report turned into a warning that did not require interpretation. Personnel in the adjacent wing began to run for exits that were now locked by the same classification that had secured the courtyard. Butcher reached a fire door that refused to yield and began to work the hinge with the same tool he had used on the field unit. Saitama moved then with the same clean economy he had used at the rail line, stepping past the line of security and into the hall as if crossing a threshold at a grocery store. The denial field dragged at nothing it could influence, and the resonance continued its patient work on the building's bones. He placed his hand against a support column that had begun to bow and applied just enough force to return it to its intended alignment, and the whine dropped by a note that felt like relief. Homelander watched from the courtyard and felt the last clean story he had been telling himself begin to fracture. In the command desk's log, The event was recorded as unauthorized movement by the subject during an active containment protocol, and the classification tightened by one more degree. On a secure line, authorization was requested for a higher-tier containment response that had not been intended for cooperative civilians, and the request was granted with language that mentioned national interest. The denial field surged once more as the system attempted to reassert control. The higher-tier containment response did not arrive with the subtlety of earlier systems, and its deployment changed the facility's purpose from research site to operational theater in a way that everyone felt before they understood it. A pair of ceiling-mounted projectors descended into the testing hall and began to map the room in a lattice of pale light, each node calibrated to emit a focused pressure wave designed to immobilize targets without visible trauma. Vought's liaison framed the activation as a precaution against further unauthorized movement, and the ground commander signed off with a reservation that would be buried in the report. Saitama watched the lattice settle around him and asked whether they needed him to stand somewhere specific. Outside the hall, the courtyard's doors remained sealed to prevent internal compromise from becoming external chaos, and the medics beyond the fence were now working in the dark, where the floodlights had failed. Starlight argued that the denial field should be fully disengaged to allow evacuation routes to reopen, and the command desk replied that doing so would introduce unacceptable risk during an active containment. Homelander took up a position at the threshold. His presence meant to reinforce the idea that everything inside was under control. Butcher forced the fire door in the adjacent wing and found a corridor already filling with personnel who had chosen to run when the glass fell. The lattice engaged with a sound that suggested pressure without wind, and the nodes began to emit in a pattern meant to discourage movement by saturating the space with overlapping waves. Instruments registered compliance across the hall as unsecured objects settled into stillness, and the lead researcher called for a halt when she saw the stress reports spike again in the supports Saitama had just corrected. The halt did not propagate in time, because the command desk had prioritized containment over convenience by design. Saitama shifted his stance to keep his balance on the foam-slick floor and asked if they were almost done, because the noise was starting to give him a headache. The irreversible escalation arrived not from Saitama's movement, but from the building's attempt to interpret the overlapping systems as a fault, and its automated safety protocols initiated a localized lockdown in the adjacent wing to protect critical infrastructure. Doors sealed on personnel attempting to evacuate, and an emergency stairwell filled with smoke from a small fire that had found insulation during the earlier resonance. Engineers shouted into headsets that the suppression system in that wing had been disabled by the classification change, and the order to re-enable it stalled behind an authorization requirement that had not existed an hour ago. The hall's observation deck began to empty as supervisors chose which emergencies to acknowledge. Starlight reached the command console nearest the wing's access and demanded a manual override, only to be told that the new site status required federal confirmation for any change that might affect containment integrity. The ground commander requested that confirmation with a tone that suggested urgency had finally outpaced policy, and the reply came with a delay measured in lives rather than seconds. Homelander listened to the exchange and felt the situation slip further from anything he could intimidate into compliance. Outside the fence, the protest had become a vigil for reasons no one wanted to admit. Inside the hall, Saitama looked toward the sealed corridor where voices had begun to echo in a way that suggested a crowd, and he asked whether someone was trapped. The researcher hesitated because the answer would require acknowledging a failure that could not be spun as a test, and the hesitation was enough. He stepped out of the lattice as if leaving a slow rain, and the node's emissions passed through him into a wall that registered nothing. Security moved to intercept and stopped when the ground commander told them to stand down. Butcher reached the stairwell door from the other side and found it hot to the touch, and he began to shout instructions to the people inside through a gap that would not admit more than air. Starlight relayed his location to the command desk and requested immediate suppression, and the request was logged behind another authorization requirement that referenced national interest. The hall's ceiling creaked as the projectors attempted to compensate for Saitama's absence from their mapped space, and the lattice reoriented with a logic that did not include mercy. When the first person inside the wing collapsed from smoke inhalation, the decision that followed would become the night's most permanent change. The command desk authorized a targeted structural isolation to prevent the fire from reaching the testing hall's power systems, and the isolation sealed the wing with a redundancy that would keep it intact even if the rest of the building failed. The order was executed with a calm that belonged in a manual rather than a moment, and the corridor's doors locked in a sequence that made Butcher's shouts useless. Starlight felt the floor beneath her feet become a boundary. Saitama reached the isolation bulkhead and placed his hand against it with the same absent patience he had shown the support column, and he asked someone to open it because people were inside. No one could, because the system had decided that saving the hall was worth losing the wing. Homelander arrived behind him with a directive that sounded like a plea, and the projectors continued to hum. The isolation bulkhead did not respond to the command desk's attempts to reverse it, because the same classification that had enabled the seal had now locked out every override that might admit regret. The wing behind it filled with smoke that the facility's systems could see but not address, and the voices on the other side had begun to weaken into a rhythm that made the hall feel smaller. Starlight pressed her palm against the console that had denied her, and demanded a federal confirmation that would not arrive in time, while the ground commander spoke into a line that had gone politely unhelpful. Homelander hovered close enough to feel the heat through the metal and told Saitama to stand down in a voice that carried more fear than command. Saitama listened to the order the way you listen to a train passing in another room, and then he knocked on the bulkhead with a small, practical tap, as if to ask permission. The metal did not answer, and the hall's projectors recalibrated around a subject they could not influence, their lattice sliding across his shoulders like light through water. The researcher began to say something about structural integrity, and then stopped because the word had lost its meaning. Butcher's voice carried through a seam that had begun to widen, and it was no longer giving instructions so much as counting. The irreversible escalation arrived when the command desk authorized a second isolation deeper in the wing to protect a power conduit that fed the hall, and the new seal propagated a meter beyond the first in a way that would trap anyone who had made it to the initial door. The decision was recorded as necessary to maintain containment integrity, and the timestamp would not include the sound of someone on the other side realizing the corridor had grown shorter. Starlight heard it anyway and turned on the liaison with a look that made him step back. Homelander watched the interaction and understood that the story he had been telling himself about control had ended without ceremony. Saitama placed his hand against the bulkhead with the same economy he had used on the rail line and the support column, and he pushed with an intent that was not dramatic but decisive. The metal yielded in a way that suggested it had always planned to, and the seam widened into a door that had not been designed to open from this side. Smoke rolled into the hall with a density that made eyes water, and the lattice's hum became a whine as the projectors attempted to map a space that had changed. Security moved again and stopped again when the ground commander told them to stand down for the last time that night. Inside the wing, people who had been leaning against walls slid toward the new opening with a hope that had not existed a second before, and Butcher began to guide them through with a roughness that counted as care. Starlight moved to assist, her observer badge now irrelevant to the work at hand, and the researcher followed with a medical kit she had not expected to use. Homelander remained at the threshold, his cape settling in the smoke as if it had grown heavier. The projectors continued to emit, their pattern now a net thrown over an empty idea. In the command desk's log, the breach was recorded as catastrophic loss of containment during an active protocol, and the classification tightened to a level that would bring consequences in the morning. On a secure line, authorization was requested to initiate a facility-wide lockdown that would prevent any further unauthorized movement, and the request was granted with language that mentioned national interest and international perception. The outer doors began to cycle again. Outside the fence, medics received the first evacuees from the wing and began to work under the intermittent light of vehicles that had not been intended as operating theaters. The protest chant had faded into a murmur that made space for sirens, and the helicopters overhead shifted into a tighter orbit that looked like concern. Inside, the hall's ceiling registered a stress change as the projectors attempted to compensate for a mapping error that had no precedent. The researcher looked up and then back at Saitama with a question she did not ask. The next decision was already in motion when the facility's backup generators kicked in to support the projectors, drawing from a grid that had not yet recovered from the citywide strain. A relay in the sub-basement reported an overload that would cascade if not isolated, and the automated system prepared to shed power from non-critical areas, including the evacuation corridor now being used. Starlight shouted for a halt that would not propagate through a network designed to prioritize containment over convenience. The lights flickered. The backup generators did exactly what they had been built to do, which was protect the hall at the expense of anything not listed as critical, and the evacuation corridor's lights dimmed with a logic that made the rescue feel temporary. A relay in the sub-basement tripped under the combined draw of the projectors and the containment systems, and the automated isolation prepared to cut power to the outer doors that had just begun to cycle. Starlight shouted for a manual reroute that would keep the corridor lit long enough to move the last of the evacuees, and the command desk replied that any deviation could compromise the integrity of the site, now classified as strategic. Homelander stood in the smoke with a posture that had nowhere left to go. Saitama listened to the corridor fill with the small sounds of people trying to breathe through fabric, and he asked whether turning the machines off would help, because it seemed like they were making things worse. The researcher began to explain the redundancy that prevented a full shutdown during an active containment, and the explanation dissolved when the lights failed entirely at the far end of the hall. Butcher's voice carried back from the dark with a request for more hands, and Starlight moved without waiting for clearance that would not come. Outside, the medics' headlights became the only horizon. The irreversible change arrived with the automated isolation that shed power to the evacuation corridor to preserve the projectors, sealing a decision that had been made in policy hours earlier. Doors that had been held open by responders swung shut on their own momentum, and the path back to the courtyard became a maze of manual releases that would not engage without authorization. The ground commander requested an emergency override with a tone that admitted failure, and the reply came with the same language that had been used all night. National interest, containment integrity, international perception. Saitama stepped toward the projector array and placed his hand against the nearest housing with the same absent patience he had shown the bulkhead, and he asked someone to confirm that shutting it down would not hurt anyone. No one could, because the system had been designed to prevent exactly this choice. He pushed anyway, not hard enough to be called dramatic, and the housing came free from its mount with a sound like a sigh. The lattice flickered as one node died, and the room's hum dropped into something closer to silence. Homelander watched the array fail in a cascade that did not require permission, and the absence of resistance made the act look casual in a way that would haunt him. The second projector followed with the same small motion, and the third, until the hall's pale net became a memory on the monitors that still had power. Engineers shouted about cascading faults and the risk of total systems loss, and the researcher said nothing because the corridor lights had come back. Butcher's silhouette moved in the renewed glow with a group of evacuees who would have otherwise remained statistics. In the command desk's log, The shutdown was recorded as deliberate sabotage by the subject during an active protocol, and the classification that followed would travel beyond the facility. A federal order was drafted before the smoke cleared, designating Saitama as a global strategic anomaly to be engaged under emergency frameworks that bypassed corporate consent. Vought's legal team began to prepare a response that would preserve ownership of the narrative if not the man. Outside the fence, the protest's murmur turned into a chant that had learned a new name. The facility's outer doors, deprived of projector support, completed their cycle with a clatter that sounded less like security and more like release. Starlight guided the last evacuees into the courtyard where medics waited, and the ground commander ordered a full stand-down on non-essential systems that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. Homelander stepped back from the hall with a look that had passed through confidence and doubt into something quieter. Saitama asked if it was okay to go now, because he still needed groceries. By morning, the footage had circled the world in loops that no legal brief could slow, and the designation had been ratified by committees that would never see the hall. Vought remained intact as a company and diminished as an authority, and the partnership with the military had become a custody dispute conducted in public. Cities reviewed their evacuation plans for incidents that did not yet have names, and investors learned a new word for risk. The world did not return to normal, because normal had been predicated on the idea that power could be hurt. The outcome is decisive and permanent.